The Galactic Orphanage of Sector 7 was a massive structure that floated in the quiet darkness of space. Its walls were made of shimmering crystal that changed colors with the station's mood. For over 40 years, this place had been home to thousands of children from hundreds of different alien species. Some had fins, some had multiple eyes, and some could phase through walls when they got emotional. But they all had one thing in common. They had nowhere else to go. Director Vexthal ran the orphanage with an iron fist, or rather, with her crystalline appendages that could slice through steel if she wanted. She was a Quarian, a species that looked like walking sculptures made of living glass. Beautiful, but cold. She prided herself on following every rule, every regulation, every single line of galactic law. In her 4 decades of service, she had placed over 10,000 children into loving homes across the galaxy. Her record was spotless. But that record was about to be tested. The transport pod arrived on a Tuesday night, which was already unusual. Most deliveries came during business hours when the full staff was present. Jake Miller was mopping the main corridor when he heard the docking alert echo through the empty halls. He paused, leaning on his mop handle, and watched through the massive viewing window as a small, battered pod attached itself to the station's southern airlock. Jake had been working as the night janitor for 3 years now. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. Back on Earth, he'd been a maintenance technician on one of the colony ships. Good with his hands, better with fixing things than talking to people. When humanity finally joined the Galactic Union 15 years ago, most humans went for the exciting jobs. Pilots, traders, diplomats. Jake just wanted something quiet. Something simple. The airlock hissed open, and 2 Galactic Child Services officers stepped through. They were Belosians, tall and green with too many joints in their arms. Between them floated a containment sphere, the kind usually reserved for transporting dangerous materials. Inside the sphere was a child. Jake squinted. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, maybe 6. Small, fragile-looking, with gray mottled skin that seemed to shift in the light. She had these thin tendrils hanging from the sides of her head, like dreadlocks made of living tissue. Her eyes were huge and dark, and they darted around frantically as the officers guided the sphere down the hallway toward the director's office. Something about the sphere bothered Jake. The girl wasn't dangerous. She was terrified. He followed at a distance, his cleaning cart squeaking softly. The officers didn't even glance at him. To them, he was just another human janitor. Barely worth noticing. Humanity was still pretty new to the galactic community, still proving themselves worthy of being taken seriously. Director Vexthal's office door slid open with a soft chime. Jake positioned himself in the hallway outside, pretending to clean the same spot on the wall over and over. His enhanced hearing, one of the few advantages humans had evolved for survival, picked up every word. "This is highly irregular," Vexthal's voice rang out like crystal bells. "You bring this child here, at night, without proper documentation." "The documentation is all there, Director," one of the officers replied. "The child is Raxin. Her homeworld was evacuated 17 years ago after the biological incident. She was found on a refugee transport. No family. No records. Nowhere else to go." There was a long pause. Jake could almost feel the temperature drop. "Raxin," Vexthal said slowly. "You brought a Raxin child to my facility." "She's just a child, Director. She needs placement. Raxians are quarantined by galactic law. Their genetic structure is unstable. Dangerous. They are forbidden from integration into civilized society. You know this." Jake felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard about the Raxians. Their government had experimented with biological weapons during some ancient war, and the weapons had backfired spectacularly. The survivors were labeled genetic hazards and locked away on colony worlds. Never allowed to leave. Never allowed to be part of normal society. He'd always thought it sounded harsh, but he'd never questioned it. After all, the galaxy was old and wise. They must have had their reasons. "The Child Welfare Codes state that all sapient juveniles must be given shelter," the officer pressed. "And the health codes state that I cannot endanger the 847 children currently under my care," Vexthal countered. "I will not violate 17 different regulations for one child. Especially not one of them." Jake peered around the corner. Through the office window, he could see the little girl in her containment sphere. She had her knees pulled up to her chest, those tendrils wrapped around herself like a blanket. She wasn't moving. Just staring at nothing with those huge, empty eyes. "Then what do you suggest we do?" the officer asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "Take her to Colony World 7. That's where her kind belongs." Colony World 7 is a quarantine zone. There are no facilities for children there. No schools. No medical care. Just containment. That is not my problem. The officer made a sound of disgust. Fine. We'll process her for long-term containment transport. It'll take about an hour to arrange. They left the office, guiding the sphere back down the hallway. As they passed Jake, one of them muttered to the other, 40 years of service and she can't show mercy to one scared kid. Jake watched them disappear around the corner, heading toward the security holding area. He stood there for a long moment, mop in hand, water dripping onto the polished floor. His shift ended in 4 hours. He could finish his work, clock out, go back to his tiny apartment on the station's residential level, and forget this ever happened. Not his problem. Not his responsibility. Just another night in the orphanage. But Jake kept seeing those eyes. That small body curled up in the sphere like she was trying to disappear. He thought about his own childhood. His mother had died when he was young. His father had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed. They'd been poor, struggling, sometimes hungry. But they'd had a home. They'd had each other. This kid had nothing. Not even a chance. The galaxy was vast and full of wisdom, but sometimes wisdom looked a lot like cowardice. Jake set down his mop. He walked toward the security holding area, his heart pounding. He had no idea what he was going to do. He just knew he couldn't walk away. When he reached the holding area, the 2 officers were filling out paperwork on their datapads. The containment sphere sat in the corner, the little girl still curled up inside. She hadn't moved. "Excuse me," Jake said. Both officers looked up, surprised to see him. "Can I help you, human?" one asked. Jake took a breath. "Yeah. I'll take her." The 2 officers stared at Jake like he'd just announced he was planning to jump out of an airlock without a suit. One of them actually laughed, a weird clicking sound that came from somewhere deep in his throat. "You'll take her? You're a janitor." "Yeah," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "A janitor who just invoked Code 7 Theta. Emergency Guardianship Protocol. Any sapient worker on site can claim temporary custody if a child is facing immediate removal to dangerous or inadequate conditions during a night shift when senior staff aren't available." The laughter stopped. Both officers exchanged glances, their expression shifting from amusement to confusion. "How do you even know about Code 7 Theta?" the second officer asked. "That law is 300 years old. Nobody uses it anymore." Jake shrugged. "I read a lot during my breaks. Gets boring around here at night." That was partly true. The whole truth was that Jake had spent his first year on the station reading every single regulation and legal code he could find. Not because he was particularly interested in galactic law, but because he'd learned early on that humans were at a disadvantage out here. Everyone else had centuries of experience with these systems. Humans were the new kids, and new kids got pushed around unless they knew how to push back. The first officer tapped his datapad, scrolling through something. His face darkened. "He's right. Code 7 Theta is still active. It was never repealed. That code was designed for emergency situations on rim worlds where proper authorities couldn't respond in time," the second officer protested. "This is a fully staffed facility in a core sector." "Director's gone home for the night," Jake pointed out. "Senior staff too. Right now, I'm the only one here who's willing to keep this kid from being shipped to a containment facility where she'll have no school, no medical care, and no future." Sounds like exactly the kind of situation the code was written for. The officers looked at each other again. Jake could see them calculating, trying to figure out if this was worth the hassle. Finally, the first one sighed and pulled out a different datapad. "Fine. But you're going to regret this, human. When Director Vexthal finds out, she's going to make your life miserable." "Probably," Jake agreed. "But I'll still have a life. That kid won't if you send her away." The paperwork took 20 minutes. Jake had to provide biometric scans, sign 17 different liability waivers, and submit to an immediate background check. The whole time, the little girl sat in her containment sphere, watching him with those huge dark eyes. She still hadn't made a sound. When the officers finally left, Jake stood alone in the holding area with the sphere floating between them. He'd done it. He'd actually claimed responsibility for an alien child that the entire galaxy considered dangerous. 3 years of keeping his head down and doing his job quietly, and now he'd painted a target on his back that would be visible from Earth. Smart, Jake. Real smart. He approached the sphere slowly, the way you'd approach a scared animal. "Hey there," he said softly. "My name's Jake. I'm going to let you out now, okay?" You're safe. I promise. He tapped the release code on the control panel. The sphere shimmered and dissolved into nothing, leaving the girl sitting on the floor. She didn't move. Just watched him with those wary, exhausted eyes. Jake crouched down to her level, keeping his distance. You got a name? For a long moment, nothing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered something in a language he didn't recognize. It sounded like wind chimes and rustling leaves mixed together. I don't understand, Jake admitted. Do you speak Galactic Common? The girl's tendrils twitched slightly. Then she held up her hands and began making shapes with her fingers. Sign language. Jake didn't know Raxian sign, but he recognized the pattern. She was trying to communicate. Okay, we'll figure this out, Jake said. He pulled out his personal data pad and activated the translation app. It took a few tries, but eventually the pad's AI figured out what she was signing. The translation appeared on the screen. Kira. My name is Kira. Kira, Jake repeated, and the girl's tendrils lifted slightly. That's a pretty name. Nice to meet you, Kira. Are you hungry? She nodded, just barely. All right. Let's get you something to eat, and then we'll find you a place to sleep. Jake led Kira through the quiet corridors of the orphanage. It was nearly midnight station time, and all the children were in bed. The lights had dimmed to their night cycle, casting everything in a soft blue glow. Kira walked close to him, so close that she was almost touching his leg, like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let him get too far away. The kitchen was locked, but Jake had override codes for maintenance access. He'd need to be able to get into every room on the station in case of emergencies. He'd never imagined he'd be using that access to break into the kitchen to feed a quarantined alien child. The industrial food synthesizers were designed to create meals for hundreds of different species. Jake scrolled through the Raxian nutrition profile, relieved to find that the machine had the data. At least someone had anticipated that Raxians might need food someday, even if they'd never anticipated one would be in an orphanage. He synthesized a simple meal, something the database labeled as suitable for Raxian children. It came out looking like purple oatmeal with chunks of something that might have been fruit. It smelled weird, kind of like vanilla mixed with copper, but Kira's eyes went wide when she saw it. She ate slowly, carefully, like she was afraid the food might be taken away. Jake sat across from her at one of the small tables, watching. Now that she was in better light, he could see that she was painfully thin. Her clothes were worn and patched multiple times. She'd been living rough for a while. When did you last eat? He asked gently. Kira held up 3 fingers. 3 hours. She shook her head and signed something. The translator pad showed, 3 days. Jake felt anger rise in his chest. 3 days. They'd left a kid without food for 3 days while they figured out what to do with her. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help Kira now. When she finished eating, Jake led her down to the basement level where the storage rooms were located. This was his domain, the place where cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment, and spare furniture were kept. Nobody came down here except him. He found the room he was looking for and unlocked it. Inside were stacks of boxes, shelves of cleaning chemicals, and in the back corner, some old furniture that had been replaced years ago but never thrown out. Including a cot. Sorry, kid, Jake said, already moving boxes out of the way. I know it's not much, but it's better than a containment sphere. He worked quickly, his maintenance training kicking in. Clear the space. Set up the cot. Make it stable. He found an old emergency blanket in one of the medical supply boxes, still sealed in plastic. There was a small lamp that somebody had discarded, and after checking the wiring, Jake got it working again. He hung an old maintenance tarp from the ceiling pipes, creating a makeshift privacy curtain. By the time he was done, one corner of the storage room had been transformed into something that almost resembled a bedroom. It wasn't pretty, but it was clean and dry and private. Kira stood in the doorway, staring. Her tendrils were moving now, swaying gently like grass in a breeze. Jake had no idea what that meant, but he hoped it was good. You can stay here, he said. For tonight, and for as long as you need. Tomorrow I'll start figuring out the legal stuff, get you properly registered, find you some better accommodations. But for now, you've got a bed and you're safe. That's what matters. Kira walked slowly into the space, her fingers trailing along the blanket. Then she turned to Jake and signed something. The translator showed, "Why are you helping me?" Jake thought about that for a moment. Why was he helping her? He could give her all sorts of noble reasons about justice and compassion and doing the right thing. But the truth was simpler. Because nobody else would, he said. Director Vexthal arrived at 6 in the morning, 2 hours earlier than usual. Jake was still in the basement with Kira when the station-wide announcement crackled through the speakers. Jake Miller, report to my office immediately. Kira's tendrils went rigid with fear. She'd been starting to relax, even managed a small smile when Jake showed her how the lamp worked. Now that fear was back in her eyes. It's okay, Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Stay here. Keep the door locked. I'll be back. The walk to Vexthal's office felt like a march to an execution. Other staff members were arriving for the morning shift, and Jake could feel their stares following him. Word had already spread. Of course it had. In a place like this, secrets lasted about 5 minutes. Director Vexthal stood behind her desk, her crystalline body reflecting the morning light in sharp, angry angles. Beside her stood 2 Galactic Health Authority inspectors, a lawyer from Child Services, and a human woman in an Earth government uniform that Jake didn't recognize. Sit down, Mr. Miller, Vexthal said. Her voice could have frozen hydrogen. Jake Saturday. His hands were sweating, but he kept them steady in his lap. Do you have any idea what you've done? Vexthal continued. In one night, you've violated health codes, safety regulations, and quarantine protocols that have been in place for 40 years. You've put every child in this facility at risk. With respect, Director, Kira isn't dangerous. She's just a kid. One of the health inspectors, a squat creature that looked like a walking mushroom, pulled up a holographic display. Raxians carry genetic markers that can trigger unpredictable mutations in other species. Their cellular structure is unstable. The science is clear. Then show me the science, Jake said. Show me one documented case of a Raxian child actually causing harm to anyone. The inspector's cap-like head darkened. The potential for harm is enough. We don't experiment with children's lives. That's exactly what you're doing, Jake shot back. You're experimenting with Kira's life by sending her to a place with no future, no care, no hope. All because of something she might potentially possibly do. That's not science. That's prejudice with a fancy name. Vexthal's hands slammed on the desk, and the sound was like breaking glass. You are a janitor. You have no authority, no training, no right to make these decisions. I have Code 7 Theta, Jake said quietly, which gives me exactly that right. That code is a loophole, and you know it. It was never meant for situations like this. Then change the law, Jake said, meeting her crystalline gaze. But until you do, Kira stays with me. The human woman in the uniform finally spoke. Mr. Miller, I'm Ambassador Patricia Chen from Earth's Galactic Relations Office. I need you to understand the position you're putting humanity in. We've only been part of the Union for 15 years. We're still establishing our credibility. Actions like this make us look reckless and unreliable. Jake had expected this. Earth's government had been walking on eggshells since joining the galactic community, desperate to prove they belonged among civilizations thousands of years older. One human janitor breaking the rules could damage that carefully built reputation. Ambassador, with respect, I don't care. The room went silent. Jake could see the shock on everyone's faces. You didn't talk to ambassadors like that. Especially not if you were nobody from nowhere. Excuse me? Ambassador Chen said. I said I don't care, Jake repeated. If humanity's credibility is based on us turning our backs on scared kids, then maybe we don't deserve credibility. Back on Earth, we had some dark times in our history. Times when we locked people up just because of where they came from or what they looked like. We're supposed to be better than that now. So if this makes humanity look bad, then I guess I'm okay with that. Vexthal made a sound like wind through broken glass. This meeting is over. Mr. Miller, you are terminated effective immediately. You have 1 hour to collect your belongings and leave the station. The child will be transferred to proper authorities. No, Jake said. I'm sorry? I said no. Jake pulled out his own datapad, hands shaking slightly but voice steady. Last night I filed for formal adoption of Kira. As of 3 hours ago, those papers were officially logged with Sector Court. You can fire me, Director, but you can't take Kira. She's legally under my guardianship now. The lawyer from Child Services looked like someone had just slapped him. He grabbed Jake's datapad and scrolled through the documents, his expression growing more panicked with each page. These are all properly filed, he muttered. The forms are correct. The fees are paid. It's all legal. That's impossible, Vexthal said. Humans can't adopt Raxians. The genetic incompatibility laws. Apply to member species of the Genetic Purity Convention of 2347, Jake interrupted. Earth wasn't part of that convention. We weren't even in space yet. Those laws don't apply to us. He'd spent half the night researching this, his eyes burning from staring at legal documents while Kira slept on her cot. But he'd found it. The loophole. Humans weren't bound by the same genetic restrictions as older species because they'd never signed the treaties that created those restrictions. The health inspector was pulling up documents now, his mushroom cap turning different colors as he read. He's right. Humans are exempt from Genetic Purity Convention protocols. They can legally adopt any species willing to accept adoption. This is absurd, Vexthal said, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in her voice now. It's the law, Jake said simply. Same law you were so concerned about me following yesterday. Ambassador Chen was staring at him with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe. Or respect. Or possibly just calculation, trying to figure out how this would play in the larger political game. Mr. Miller, she said carefully, are you aware that if you pursue this, the case will go to sector court? You'll be challenging 40 years of quarantine policy. This will become very public. Very complicated. I know. You'll need lawyers. Resources. Time. The galactic legal system can take years to process cases like this. I've got time, Jake said. And I'm good at reading legal documents during my breaks. The child services lawyer was sweating now, a weird purple liquid that leaked from pores on his forehead. Director, if he's filed formal adoption papers, we can't simply remove the child. The court will need to rule on the validity of the adoption before any other action can be taken. How long? Vexthal demanded. Minimum? 3 months for an initial hearing. Could be longer. 3 months with that child living in my basement. Actually, Jake said, I'll be finding us an apartment. I'm assuming I'm still fired? Vexthal's glare could have melted steel. Oh, you're very fired. Fair enough. Jake stood up. Then I'll collect my final paycheck and start looking for a new job. Kira and I will be out by the end of the day. He turned to leave, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone in the room could hear it. He'd just burned every bridge he had. No job. No income. A court case that could take years. And a scared alien kid depending on him. But as he reached the door, Ambassador Chen called out. Mr. Miller? He paused. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I hope you win. Jake nodded once and left. He had an hour to pack his life and figure out how to take care of a child he'd known for less than 12 hours. But as he walked back down to the basement where Kira was waiting, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he was doing something that mattered. The news hit the galactic networks within hours. Human janitor defies quarantine law to adopt alien child. By evening, Jake's face was on every news feed across 3 sectors. Some outlets called him a hero. Others called him a reckless idiot who was endangering the entire station. A few conspiracy theorists claimed he was part of some secret human plot to undermine galactic authority. Jake ignored all of it. He was too busy trying to figure out how to be a parent. The apartment he found was tiny, barely 40 square meters on the lower residential level of the station. It had a small living area, a cramped kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom that required you to stand sideways to close the door. The walls were the standard bays that seemed to exist on every space station in the galaxy. It was ugly and cramped and the air recycler made a weird humming sound. It was perfect. Kira stood in the doorway, clutching the emergency blanket Jake had given her like it was the most valuable thing in the universe. Her tendrils were moving in that slow swaying pattern that Jake was starting to recognize as contentment. Or at least, not terror. What do you think? Jake asked. Kira walked slowly through the space, her fingers trailing along the walls. She stopped at the window, pressing her face against the transparent aluminum to stare at the stars beyond. Then she turned to Jake and signed something. The translator pad showed, "This is ours." "Yeah," Jake said, his throat suddenly tight. "This is ours." The first week was chaos. Jake had to register Kira for medical care, which meant fighting with 3 different health agencies who insisted she needed to be examined in a containment facility. He refused. Eventually he found a human doctor, Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, who'd recently arrived on the station and was willing to do a house call. Dr. Rodriguez was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years working in disaster zones on Earth. After examining Kira thoroughly, she pulled Jake aside. "That girl is malnourished, dehydrated, and has signs of chronic stress," she said bluntly. "But there's nothing wrong with her genetics. Nothing unstable. Nothing dangerous. Whoever came up with these quarantine protocols was either ignorant or malicious. Maybe both. Can you put that in a report? Jake asked. Already done. I'm submitting it to the Sector Health Authority today. And Jake? She put a hand on his shoulder. What you're doing matters. Don't let them grind you down. Next came education. Kira couldn't attend the orphanage school anymore, and the public schools on the station refused to enroll her due to her unclear legal status. So Jake did what humans had been doing for thousands of years when the system failed them. He improvised. He set up a learning space in the apartment's living area. Used his personal savings to buy educational programs designed for multi-species learning. Spent hours each night after job hunting during the day, teaching Kira Galactic Common, basic math, history. She was brilliant. Learned faster than any kid he'd ever seen. Within 2 weeks, she could speak Common well enough to have simple conversations instead of just signing. Why do stars burn? She asked one evening, her accent strange but understandable. Jake pulled up a holographic display showing nuclear fusion. Because they are squeezing hydrogen so hard it turns into helium, and that releases energy. Kira's eyes went wide. They're squeezing light out of nothing? Basically, yeah. Humans know how to do that. We figured it out about 200 years ago. Nearly blew ourselves up a few times learning though. Kira's tendrils curled in what Jake now recognized as amusement. Humans are strange. Yeah, Jake agreed, grinning. We really are. But it wasn't all progress. Jake's savings were running out fast. He'd applied to 37 different jobs and been rejected by all of them. Turns out becoming the galaxy's most controversial human wasn't great for employment prospects. The apartment rent was due in 2 weeks, and he had no idea how he'd pay it. Then the messages started arriving. The first one came from a human colony on the Outer Rim. A maintenance supervisor named Tom Chen offering Jake a job. Saw what you did. We need people like you out here. Job's yours if you want it. Pay's not great, but it's honest work. The second message was from a Belosian family. Our daughter was denied placement at 3 orphanages because of her genetic condition. Your story gave us hope. We're fighting now too. Thank you. Then more came. Dozens. Hundreds. Other humans offering jobs, money, support. Alien families sharing their own stories of discrimination and exclusion. Students asking how they could help. Some messages were just a few words, don't give up. One message stood out. It was from a kid named Tommy, one of the orphans from the Galactic Orphanage. Kira was my friend. I miss her. Can you tell her I said hi? Jake showed Kira the message. She stared at it for a long time, her tendrils absolutely still. I have a friend, she whispered, like she couldn't quite believe it. You've got lots of friends now, kid. The sector court hearing was scheduled for 3 months out, but the case was already making waves. Other quarantined species were filing their own legal challenges, citing Jake's adoption as precedent. Rights groups were organizing protests. The Genetic Purity Convention was facing scrutiny for the first time in decades. Ambassador Chen contacted Jake directly. You've created a political nightmare, Mr. Miller. Sorry, Jake said, not sounding sorry at all. Don't be. The Earth government has decided to officially support your case. We're assigning you a legal team. Pro bono. Jake almost dropped his data pad. Why? You said this made humanity look bad. I said it made us look reckless, Chen corrected. Turns out a lot of species think reckless compassion is better than calculated cruelty. Humanity's approval ratings in the Union have actually gone up. People like that we're willing to fight for what's right, even when it's inconvenient. I didn't do this for approval ratings. I know. That's exactly why it's working. The legal team arrived 2 days later. 3 lawyers, all human, all looking determined. The lead attorney was a woman named Rebecca Stone who'd prosecuted war crimes back on Earth. Mr. Miller, she said, shaking his hand. I've reviewed your case. The legal argument is sound, but we need to do more than just win on a technicality. We need to prove that the entire quarantine system is based on false science and prejudice. That means we need evidence. Lots of it. Like what? Medical studies. Historical records. Expert testimony. We need to show that Raxians were quarantined not because they were dangerous, but because they were convenient scapegoats after their government fell. We need to turn this from a custody case into a civil rights case. Jake looked at Kira, who was listening from the bedroom doorway. She'd been following the conversation, her galactic common good enough now to understand most of it. Can we win? He asked. Rebecca smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who'd spent years fighting impossible fights and winning them anyway. Mr. Miller, by the time I'm done, the Genetic Purity Convention is going to wish they'd never heard of Raxians. Or humans. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag on the living room floor, Kira safely asleep in the bedroom. Through the window, he could see the stars. The same stars humans had looked up at for thousands of years, dreaming of what was out there. Well, now they knew. The galaxy was full of wonders and horrors, ancient wisdom and ancient prejudices. It was beautiful and terrible and complicated. And somehow, Jake Miller, former maintenance tech and fired janitor, was right in the middle of changing it. His data pad chimed softly. Another message. This one was from Director Vexthal. I still think you're a fool, Mr. Miller. But I've been reading the messages from families whose children were denied placement because of genetic discrimination. Perhaps I've been a fool too. I hope you win your case. Jake read it twice, then set the pad down. Maybe the galaxy could change. Maybe compassion could spread like ripples in water, touching places you never expected. Or maybe he was just an idiot who'd gotten lucky so far. Either way, he had a court date in 3 months and a kid depending on him. He'd figure the rest out as he went. That's what humans did best. The sector court was nothing like the courtrooms Jake had seen in old Earth movies. Instead of wood and marble, everything was made of some kind of living crystal that pulsed with soft light. The ceiling was transparent, showing the stars beyond. 300 seats filled the gallery, and every single one was occupied. Reporters from 40 different species crowded the press section. Security had to turn away another 100 people at the door. Jake sat at the defendant's table in the only suit he owned, a cheap synthetic thing he'd bought at a station market years ago. Next to him was Rebecca Stone and her legal team, surrounded by stacks of data pads and holographic displays. And beside Jake, in a chair that had been specially adjusted for her size, sat Kira. She wore a simple blue dress that Dr. Rodriguez had helped Jake pick out. Her tendrils were braided back in a style that the Raxian community on Colony World 7 had taught her through video messages. In the 3 months since Jake had adopted her, she'd grown. Not just physically, though she'd gained weight and her skin had lost that grayish pallor of malnutrition. She'd grown in confidence. In hope. The judge entered, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Judge Valcora was a Valorian, one of the oldest species in the galaxy. She had 6 eyes arranged in a circle around her head, skin like weathered stone, and was rumored to be over 400 years old. She presided over some of the most important cases in galactic history. We are here, she began, her voice like grinding stones, to determine the validity of Jake Miller's adoption of the minor Kira, and to examine the broader implications of the Genetic Purity Convention as it applies to Raxian individuals. This court will hear arguments from both sides. The prosecution went first. Their lead attorney was a Quarian named Lexton, all sharp angles and cold logic. He presented graphs, statistics, historical data. He talked about genetic instability, about the biological weapons that had devastated the Raxian homeworld, about the responsibility to protect the greater galactic population. The quarantine protocols, Lexton argued, were not created out of malice. They were created out of necessity. The Raxian genetic structure carries markers that could potentially trigger mutations in other species. We cannot gamble with billions of lives based on one human's emotional attachment to a single child. He spoke for 2 hours. By the time he finished, Jake felt sick. The way Lexton described it, the quarantine sounded reasonable. Logical. Necessary. Then Rebecca Stone stood up. Your Honor, she began, the prosecution has presented a lot of impressive-sounding science. But here's what they haven't presented, a single documented case of a Raxian actually causing harm to another species through genetic contamination. She pulled up her own holographic display. We've examined 40 years of medical records. We've interviewed doctors, geneticists, biologists from 17 different species. Not one could provide evidence of Raxian genetic markers causing mutations in other species. Not one. Lexton stood. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The potential. The potential is theoretical, Rebecca interrupted. Based on computer models created 50 years ago with technology that's now considered primitive. We've run those same models with modern equipment. The results? There is no elevated risk. Raxians are no more genetically dangerous than humans, Belosians, or Quarians. She gestured, and a new display appeared. What we did find was interesting though. The quarantine protocols were implemented not by medical authorities, but by the Galactic Security Council. And they were implemented 3 weeks after the Raxane government collapsed during a civil war. A civil war that left valuable mining operations on Raxane worlds unprotected. Jake watched the gallery. People were leaning forward now, paying attention. Within 6 months of the quarantine, Rebecca continued, those mining operations had been seized by corporations based on 3 council-member worlds. Funny coincidence, isn't it? The quarantine didn't protect anyone's health. It protected someone's profit margins. The courtroom erupted in noise. Judge Valcora had to call for order 3 times. The trial lasted 5 days. Rebecca brought in Dr. Rodriguez, who testified about Kira's perfect health. She brought in geneticists who tore apart the old studies. She brought in historians who documented the suspicious timing of the quarantine. And on the final day, she called Jake to the stand. Mr. Miller, Rebecca said, why did you adopt Kira? Jake looked at Kira in her seat. She gave him a small smile, her tendrils swaying gently. Because she needed help, Jake said simply. And because nobody else was going to do it. Were you concerned about the genetic risks? Not really. I read the studies. The real ones, not the propaganda. There was no risk. What if there had been a risk? What if Kira actually was genetically dangerous? Jake thought about that. Then I would have taken precautions. Found ways to keep everyone safe. But I still would have helped her. You don't abandon kids just because they're inconvenient or complicated. Lexton stood for cross-examination. Mr. Miller, you're not a scientist. You're not a doctor. You're a janitor with no formal education beyond basic colony ship maintenance. What makes you think you're qualified to make these kinds of decisions? I'm not qualified, Jake admitted. But I'm willing. And sometimes that's more important than being qualified. That's reckless. Maybe. But you know what's more reckless? Locking up an entire species based on bad science and greed. That's not just reckless. That's evil. The courtroom went silent. Lexton stared at Jake, his crystalline face unreadable. Then he sat down without another word. Judge Valcora took 3 days to deliberate. When the court reconvened, Jake could barely breathe. Kira held his hand so tightly her fingers were shaking. This court, Judge Valcora began, has reviewed all evidence and testimony. We have examined the scientific data, the historical records, and the legal precedents. We have also examined our own conscience. She paused, her 6 eyes moving around the room. The adoption of Kira by Jake Miller is hereby declared valid and legally binding. Furthermore, this court rules that the Genetic Purity Convention protocols as applied to Raxane individuals are based on insufficient scientific evidence and are therefore unenforceable. All quarantine restrictions on Raxians are to be lifted immediately. The courtroom exploded. People were cheering, crying, shouting. Jake couldn't hear anything over the rushing in his ears. Kira was hugging him, her tendrils wrapped around his arm, and he realized he was crying too. Rebecca was shaking his hand, saying something he couldn't quite hear. Ambassador Chen was there suddenly, smiling. Dr. Rodriguez pushed through the crowd to hug both of them. But the moment that stuck with Jake came later, after the chaos had died down. They were walking through the station corridor, heading home, when they passed a news display. It showed coverage of Colony World 7, where Raxane families were boarding transports, leaving quarantine for the first time in 40 years. Children playing in the corridors, tendrils swaying with joy. Adults crying as they stepped onto ships that would take them to real worlds, real lives, real futures. Kira stopped and stared at the display. We did that, she asked softly. You did that, Jake said. By being brave enough to trust me. No, Kira said, looking up at him. You did that by being brave enough to trust me first. The years that followed changed the galaxy in ways both large and small. Kira grew up in that tiny apartment, attended integrated schools, made friends from a dozen different species. She was brilliant at mathematics and wanted to be an engineer. Jake worked as a maintenance supervisor at a human-run facility, good honest work that paid enough to keep them comfortable. But Kira never forgot where she came from. When she turned 18, she started an organization called the Second Chance Foundation. It helped families adopt children from species that had been marginalized or discriminated against. She traveled across sectors, speaking at schools and orphanages, telling her story. And Jake went with her, usually standing in the back of the room, still uncomfortable with attention. He was just a guy who'd done what needed doing. Nothing special. But the galaxy disagreed. The Galactic Orphanage of Sector 7 eventually installed a plaque in their basement, in the storage room where everything had started. It read, "In this room, Jake Miller proved that civilization is not measured by our laws, but by our willingness to question them when they cause harm." Below it, in smaller letters that had been added later, "My dad built me a bed here when no one else would. Now I help build beds for everyone else. Kira Miller." 20 years after that night in the storage room, Jake stood in that same basement with Kira, now a grown woman with her own foundation and her own family. She'd married a Belosian engineer and had 2 kids who called Jake Grandpa. "Do you ever regret it?" Kira asked, studying the plaque. "You gave up a lot for me." Jake thought about his old life. The quiet nights mopping floors. The simplicity of not being responsible for anything important. Then he thought about the life he'd gained. The daughter he'd raised. The families he'd helped. The small corner of the galaxy he'd made just slightly better. "Not even for a second," he said. Kira smiled and hugged him. Her tendrils were gray now, touched with the silver of age. But her eyes still had that same light they'd had when she was 5 years old and scared and alone. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "Thank you for trusting me, kid." They left the basement together, and somewhere in the station above them, another scared child was finding hope. Another family was taking a chance on love despite the rules and regulations. Another human was doing something reckless and compassionate and entirely necessary. Because that's what humans did. They saw someone who needed help, and they built them a bed, even if it had to be in a storage room. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.